Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here to participate into the launch of the report Disabled by Design, the human impact of the hostile environment on people seeking asylum. This event is hosted by JRS UK and the Centre for Human Rights Law at SOAS. Just a little bit about JRS, that is the Jesuit Refugee Service. JRS works with refugees and forcibly displaced people in 15 countries worldwide. In the UK, JRS works specifically with people held in immigration detention and with destitute people seeking asylum, and many that have come out from immigration detention. JRS runs detention outreach service to Hammersmith and Combrook immigration removal centers, providing practical casework and pastoral support, and also provides accommodation, classes, activities, legal advice for destitute asylum seekers, most of whom are pursuing fresh claims. JRS UK also conducts research and policy work, as we are here, to amplify the voices of people with experience of detention and people in the asylum system. The Centre for Human Rights Law at SOAS aims to provide a space for scholarship and cooperative approaches on human rights in practice. We are committed to promoting cooperation between academics and practitioners worldwide. I am very proud to introduce this project because the project was co-authored by Nicolette Busuttil from SOAS and Dr. Nicolette Busuttil and Dr. Sophie Cartwright from JRS. Just briefly about me, I am Clara Della Croce. I am a reader at SOAS. I have been supporting asylum seekers and refugees for 2 decades and assisting also. I had the opportunity, perhaps, to assist with the UK's Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Program, and that are refugees from the Syrian conflict. So the scheme gave, from then I came in contact with different migrants, their families experiencing the asylum process, including people with disability. I came across a series of people, so-called, inverted commas, failed asylum seekers, and I followed their trajectory into the support system, or mostly about the lack of it. As I said, the report is the launch of the report, and we are here and the report highlights the experience of people that have been refused their asylum claim. Within the context is the UK, and people that have, in many cases, become destitute. The report shows the hostile environment and how it accentuates people's experience with the asylum system, creating huge barriers for them to essential services, and in some occasions also criminalizing them for their daily activities. The report outlines how the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, to which the United Kingdom is a state party to, and is disregarded within the context of the asylum system. And also the report outlines how the hostile environment can intensify and entrench disability among people seeking and people whose asylum claim has been refused. The hostile environment creates barriers for them based specifically on their immigration status. Asylum seekers with rights of appeal exhausted are the main focus of this report. They lose their rights to support, and that in practice, in the majority of cases, reinforces their vulnerability. They are left destitute, prohibited from working or claiming public funds, and they are reliant entirely on charity or informal help to survive. The report shows how people with their rights of appeal exhausted face the support system. The authors have looked into the situation of 29 people whose asylum claim has been refused and were declared appeals rights exhausted. They have identified that disability and impairment were common among this group, and felt that the asylum system and the hostile environment had disabled those people with lived experience in a very personal fashion. The report identifies a series of barriers which are not exclusive to people with disability, but which the hostile environment accentuate their conditions. They examine, for instance, barriers to participation in community, barriers to family life, forcing separation among family members, barriers to health, how a wider social and economic exclusion had huge damage to those people's health. I think the conclusion of this report is paramount to highlight the conclusion of this report, because it brings the contradiction between the disability rights law and the commitment of the United Kingdom and its hostile environment policy. The CRPD requires the UK to remove barriers and provide support to people. The hostile environment instead creates barriers and withholds that support. The hostile environment creates and furthers disability and denies disabled migrants basically rights. The report highlights the discrimination that exists on the basis of disability. That these policies have a disproportionate and unjustifiable impact on disabled people. I now leave to the authors of the report to further explore with you their findings here today, and also Dr. Rebecca Yeo to comment further on this. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you the speakers. First of all, Rebecca Yeo who is based at the University of Exeter. She has been a researcher and activist focused on intersectionality and injustice associated with disability and forced migration for several decades. Rebecca has a book on disabling migration controls, where she argues that the restrictions imposed on people seeking asylum are actively disabling, and that insights from the disabled people movement are highly relevant to building greater justice. She's the co-founder of the Disability and Migration Network. The one of the authors of the report is Sophie Cartwright. Is the senior Sophie is the senior policy officer at the Jesuit Refugee Service UK, and research associate at the Centre for Criminology at the University of Oxford. Much of her recent work focuses on asylum, destitution, and detention. Dr. Nicolette Busuttil is a lecturer in law at the College of Law at SOAS. Her teaching and research focus on refugees and other migrants under international and EU human rights law. She focused on disabled people and in particular on the implications of the adoption of the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability. Without further ado, I will invite to the floor the speakers, the authors of the report. Perhaps Nicolette, if you would like to start, and then Sophie. They will speak for 25 minutes each. Well, both 12 minutes each.
Thank you very much, Clara. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being with us here today. Thank you to Clara and Rebecca for reading the report, for sharing and speaking and having this conversation with us. Over the next few minutes, over the next 12 minutes or so, I will first say a few words about the idea behind the project, how the project worked, how we set it up, how we ended up chatting with people refused asylum about disability rights. And I'll then hand over to Sophie, who will speak in more detail about the broad overview we've just heard about of the report, about the key findings and what to make of them. So, as Clara mentioned, I am based at SOAS, and the report that we are launching today is the end of a small project that we carried out over last year, which was generously funded by a SOAS Knowledge Exchange and Impact Grant, which is aimed to help SOAS academics share research with the wider community and reflect on it outside the academy. Now, my research generally focuses on the intersection between disability human rights law, particularly through the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability, and how it applies for migrants, non-citizens, refugees, more broadly. I generally focus on the European region, but this time, together with Sophie, with JRS rather, and the population who are served by JRS, we set out on a collaboration to explore how the protection and rights that are envisaged for disabled people in the UN Convention, so in the CRPD, is actually experienced by people who are seeking but who have been refused asylum in the UK. And so for this category of people, which, as we just heard, is the cohort that JRS works with, these are people who sought asylum, have been refused asylum. Even though they are still seeking it, they are considered subject to immigration control, and as a result, their lives are very much governed by the hostile environment that excludes them from most areas of everyday life. So they are considered appeal rights exhausted, subjected to the full force of the hostile environment, which means they generally cannot work, cannot rely on public funding, be it asylum support or by claiming disability support, cannot rent property, cannot open a bank account. They bear the brunt of measures that are designed to exclude as an aim and result of state law and policy. And so what we try to do and what we explore in the report is how we have, on the one hand, the CRPD as an instrument that under international human rights law now sets the minimum standard for how states should treat disabled people. And from an international human rights law perspective, the CRPD is quite an innovative instrument, both in its design, in terms of its negotiation, and also in terms of the substance and the legal obligations that it formulated for state parties. So beyond acknowledging for the first time in a binding international instrument that disabled people have equal worth and value as non-disabled people, no matter the impairment, the Convention sets out as its purpose, to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by disabled people and promote respect for inherent dignity. So we have a framework that envisages full human rights for all disabled people, regardless of impairment, and that was drafted following significant involvement by disabled people through particularly disabled people's organizations. So the result of this is that we have a treaty that sets out an understanding of disability that recognizes that disability is not, or the enjoyment of rights of disabled people is not an individualized problem, but very much follows an understanding where disability is that which ensues when impairment interacts with barriers that exist in society that create disadvantage, that create exclusion, that prevent the enjoyment of human rights. And for our purposes, it's important that participation is not only key in terms of the drafting of the convention, but in terms of the monitoring obligations that arise that should follow the implementation of the convention itself. Because even though migrants were not very much part of the drafting process of the CRPD, or at least not explicitly so, and they are, and they have been in efforts by the Disability Rights Committee, for example, a focus to a certain extent in how the convention gets understood. And the obligations that arise as a result in the CRPD focus very much on the removal of barriers that disable individuals and the provision of support that the state is enjoined to provide in order to ensure that these human rights are promoted, protected, and fulfilled, right? So, for example, when it comes to the right to health, in a disability rights framework, we have a key component that disabled people should be entitled to healthcare, not to healthcare that is needed because of impairment, that is needed because of disability. So we're not discussing cuts across entitlements which are restricted to emergency or primary care, as a basic example. Now, none of this should be particularly controversial, right? But the reality is that when it comes to migration or entitlement to non-citizens, disability often ends up being overlooked. And I'm very glad that we have Rebecca here commenting on this, because her work has, over the years, shown how in the UK migration context, for example, disabled asylum seekers, migrants are invisibilized. And this can happen through law and policy itself, whether it is the persistent use of vulnerability as a proxy for disability. But the framing basically reifies older understandings of disability as an individualized problem, and that doesn't really carry any or produce any reckoning of the system that might be involved in creating it. And for disabled migrants, right, within the UK as well, this exclusion from rights or this non-enjoyment of rights is also clearly bound up with the landscape for disabled people and their general assault on their rights that we can point to specific examples. So disabled people who are likelier to die in poverty, die earlier, less likely to have the support they need in order to actually exercise the rights they need or the support they need to live independent lives. And this emphasis then on disability rights is also, so for our purposes, we set out to scrutinize how existing systems reproduce disability through the imposition of barriers and the withholding of support. Because the architecture of disability human rights, as we've been discussing it, is one that is premised on valuing individual worth, formulating what the state must do in return, concretely removing those barriers, providing support. And the idea here is ensuring access to the full range of rights and not simply to some rights, right? So it's not about being free from inhuman or degrading treatment, but actually having a fuller understanding of a flourishing life where all aspects of inclusion, where all aspects of one's, let's say, humanity can be fulfilled. And I know I've spent a lot of time talking about this because I think we are all aware that the hostile environment, the architecture of the hostile environment is at the outset complete opposition to this vision of full participation, full enjoyment, full framework that provides support. hostile environment as a set of law and policy instruments, which is premised on exclusion and intentional effort to make life difficult for people so that it compels them to leave. And Sophie will speak in greater detail about how this plays out. But I did want to highlight, this does not mean that there aren't exceptions, right? And this is where that when it comes to disability in the migration context, disability in the hostile environment, its governance is very much through exception. So there are measures in place that on paper, for some people, the legal framework does contemplate some disabled people to have a measure of support, for example, some people to have access under the Care Act or under Section 4, right? Access to prevent destitution or to counteract some of its effects. But as the people JRS work with know and have experienced, this support is not necessarily all that available in practice. It is also not one that adopts an understanding of disability in its broadest forms, one that looks, one that seems to adopt much more of a threshold approach to disability and protection rather than a fuller understanding that seeks to meet the individuals with their needs and look at what their needs might be. And as we explore in the report, this is particularly problematic because in committing itself to the CRPD, the UK did undertake to adopt all appropriate laws, administrative and other measures to implement convention rights, to abolish laws that constitute discrimination against disabled people, and clearly to take into account the protection and promotion of the human rights of disabled people in all policies and programs. Now, the UK did seek to include a reservation to limit the application of the convention in specific areas, specifically, or rather, in the right to liberty to freedom of movement. But as we explore in the report, that in itself does not mean that the UK does not have obligations towards its disabled non-citizens. Clearly, as an instrument of international law, it cannot be relied on by people in individual claims. It's not the Human Rights Act, right? But it does give something. They remain commitments that the UK has made under international law. And our aim was to bring it to participants to reflect on this together and try to see how we can make it tangible. How do migrants, as people refused asylum, encounter disability human rights? Because one of the key issues is that we need to make the intersectional harm that is experienced by migrants visible. And our aim was to speak about this framework to individuals, to disabled migrants and non-disabled migrants who are supported by JRS, and identify what they think about this framework, whether it is something, whether the CRPD adds something to their lives, to their self-advocacy, to encounters that they might have with legal representatives who are also woefully uninformed, maybe when it comes to the CRPD. And so for us, a clear part of the project was discussing and reflecting on disability human rights with people who are in the asylum system, to focus on participation and try to embed that participatory ethos, and in that way resisting the invisibility that we see so often in the migration sphere. And as I'll hand over to Sophie in a second, because I just want to conclude that the way that we ended up structuring the report was to focus on 3 areas that ended up coming out from discussions we had with participants over 3 workshops that really seemed to resonate with their experiences, where they had experienced challenges into their enjoyment of specific human rights, which is health, family, and participation in the community. And for us, the clear theme is that in the hostile environment, what we have is a system that is in place that inverts the role of the state from one that removes barriers to provide support to one that instead places barriers and then withholds support unless and only in very exceptional circumstances. It inverts the premise of disability justice, and while the aim of the hostile environment might not be explicit discrimination based on the basis of disability, its effect can be disproportionately felt by disabled people. And we would argue that this is problematic, merits further scrutiny, and I'll hand over to Sophie to tell us exactly how people felt and why they felt this was problematic. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Sophie, would you?
Yeah, thanks. Hi everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much, Nicolette and Clara. Yeah, I'll just say a little bit more about how the hostile environment works, and then give a window onto what we heard from research participants, onto some key report findings. Fundamentally, as you've heard, the overarching finding of this research was that the hostile environment and wider hostile asylum policies create disability, and as such, they really have a crushing impact on human lives. Now, first, just to note that even before the hostile environment, poverty is designed into the asylum system as a whole. People waiting for a decision on their asylum claims can't access mainstream public funds and are typically banned from working. So to survive, they have to rely on asylum support. That's very basic, often unsafe accommodation, and minimal financial support, which is, in reality, insufficient to meet basic needs. I think you're choosing between toothpaste and nappies very often. Now, we've already heard that if an asylum claim is refused, then all support is cut off and people are left completely destitute, and they're really vulnerable in this situation to abuse, exploitation, and deterioration in mental and physical health. It's really important to note that this can go on for years. At JRS, we work with people who've lived in destitution for over a decade, and through this time, it is this experience of exclusion is shaping them, shaping their experience of the world and their minds and bodies. It's long-standing government policy to manufacture destitution in this way, and then bring in the hostile environment, as it was introduced in 2012 and continues to operate. Nicolette and Clara have already said quite a bit about how that works. I think it's just important to note here that in England specifically, people without immigration status can be charged for hospital care and are sometimes refused care if they can't pay. And that's very specifically hostile environment policy. We're looking at this system that intentionally excludes people and creates barriers for them and is bad for their mental and physical health, and is often imposed on people with pre-existing disabilities who have often fled previous trauma, and that has already impacted them. And that stands in stark contrast to disability rights law requiring states to remove barriers and facilitate participation, and really specifically to facilitate disabled people's access to healthcare that they need as a result of their disability and that prevents further disablement, to be really there at the start to prevent further disablement. That's really a fundamental tension with the hostile environment, and as Nicolette explained, we explored it in workshops with people refused asylum, and disability and impairment were common among this group, and they felt really strongly in many cases that the asylum system and hostile environment had disabled them personally. We focused, as Nicolette said, on three barriers in three key areas where the CIRPD highlights disabled people's rights. That's participation in community, enjoyment of family life, and health status. Here, for brevity, I'm going to focus on barriers to participation in community life and barriers to health status. So, barriers to participation in community were: first, enforced poverty prevented any kind of, well, a lot of social participation, and it rendered people invisible. It was really hard not to be able to go for a meal with friends, or enter into a lot of spaces that other people are able to enter, but that actually cost money. Isolating forms of asylum accommodation, notably asylum hotels, cut people off from community. Racism and stigma dehumanize people. One participant, for example, explained that they felt like they were treated like outcasts. And then not being able to work, of course, it created poverty, but also it cuts off a key route into community life for people. So these barriers were really felt on many levels. That's the barriers to participation in community. Now, barriers to health. First, healthcare. NHS charging and attendant data sharing was a fundamental barrier to healthcare for many participants. Many had actually been refused treatment because they could not pay. For example, one man who was participating in our workshops had needed crutches and had been denied them. He had been told he had to pay several £100s that he simply did not have, and in the end he had to go away without the crutches, which he needed after a road accident. Other people had been deterred from attending hospital because they were afraid of incurring debts. One thing to be aware of is that debts can actually have a negative impact on future attempts to regularise your immigration status. So you get caught in a trap. And this creates real fear for people that can stop them from accessing badly needed healthcare. Now, obviously, it's really unsurprising that inability to access healthcare or difficulty accessing it was very, very bad for health. And it could indeed lead to disablement and further disablement. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. It's important to note that several instances of NHS charging had occurred when people were waiting for decisions on asylum claims, as well as afterwards. And when you're waiting for a decision on your claim, you are supposed to be eligible for free NHS care. So this highlights the broad reach and impact of the hostile environment and how it seeps into the entire asylum system. So that's healthcare specifically, but beyond healthcare, wider and social economic exclusion was also hugely damaging to health, and in that sense was a big barrier to health status. Repeatedly, participants described serious deterioration of mental and physical health due to extended destitution. You've got nowhere safe to sleep for years, nowhere secure, food insecurity and malnutrition, and lack of a secure place to rest were both noted as key factors. So was the chronic stress created by asylum limbo. All of this made it incredibly difficult to manage chronic conditions. For example, if the doctor tells you that you absolutely cannot eat a particular kind of food, you need to have a very strict diet, or a problem you have is going to get worse, there's often not much you can do about it. If you're destitute and you have to eat whatever food is available. And many participants had acquired disabilities, including diabetes and high blood pressure, through life in destitution. Mental health was also a big focus of the workshops, and dehumanization and exclusion was thought to be really concretely bad for mental health. In the words of one participant, well, stereotyping someone every day might cause anxiety. Let them know they're nothing in society until they get their paper. If this happens to you routinely, this day after day, week after week, for years, your mental health is going to be very different at the end of it. Disabled participants and participants with disabled family members had faced even greater barriers to healthcare, and obviously this was very distressing. It often also led to greater disablement, to the impairments that they had becoming worse. And as Nicolette was saying, that the kind of support that is even supposed to be available for disabled people in these situations often was just impossible to access in practice. Now, notably, while participants felt that exclusion and disablement had intensified after a refusal of asylum, many had also experienced disablement while awaiting for an asylum decision. And for example, we've done other research that highlights how food in asylum hotels has sometimes been so poor that an extended stay in one will have a serious and often long-term impact on physical health. Now, one thing that was really clear that came out here was that it wasn't just barriers to healthcare that could disable people, but the entire system, the entire hostile asylum system and the hostile environment working in concert. So the hostile environment disables people and then further excludes them, and that means that it's then creating a situation that it's obliged to respond to with support, but under law, but its own law and policy also states that it's going to exclude the people to whom it has obligations that it's created. This I think highlights a fundamental contradiction. It shows how hostile environment certainly undermines disabled people's rights and accordingly their dignity and flourishing. It also highlights how the hostile environment works against human flourishing in general, and is destructive to community and to a good life. It has also, I think, shown profound problems with making exceptions to disability law and indeed rights law in general. Rights frameworks are interdependent as human flourishing is interdependent. And if you have one set of laws that seek to protect the person and uphold the person and build up community, that project will be fundamentally undermined by saying that this group of people that are excluded from it and it doesn't apply to them. So the lens of disability rights shines a light on how the hostile environment operates more broadly. It creates a space in which personhood is overlooked and in which the most basic rights are denied rather than upheld. And it's very bad for society to be doing this to people. This is particularly salient now because the government is actually extending hostile environment. It's in legislation. It's enacting changes from the Immigration Act 2016 that will deepen and extend destitution, potentially even to families. These were never enacted at the time, essentially because they were so damaging that I think they were pulled back from. This will be catastrophic for the community that we work with, and it will really be catastrophic for disabled people who have sought asylum in the UK but been denied it. It will leave them with really nowhere to turn. So we're calling for an end to the hostile environment and no recourse to public funds conditions, and accordingly for everyone to be able to access the support they need to live in dignity. For people seeking asylum to have the right to work where they're able to stop enforcing poverty. A simplified route to status for everyone living here long term. One thing this research has clearly shown is that extended limbo and destitution is extraordinarily damaging, and it's not compatible with respect for human rights law or for respect for human dignity. So that's a brief snapshot of what we're hoping, what we're envisaging in the report, and I will now, I think, pass over to Rebecca for her to reflect a bit more on broader themes.
Hi, thank you so much. Is that working? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for writing this really important report and for engaging with these issues. Yes, I want to start by congratulating you on doing a great job at drawing attention to the fact that UK asylum and immigration policy is explicitly designed to restrict and withhold support from people. So it's brilliant work discussing this with people who are at the front line of facing these restrictions. And as the disabled people's movement has argued for decades, it's disabling to be prevented from accessing essential services and support. So your report very effectively highlights that the asylum system creates new impairments and health conditions. And as you put it, people are disabled by design. And given that the asylum system is designed to be disabling, you explain that finding disabled people in the system is not unusual. It's the norm, unless, as is often the case, the definition of disability is commonly assumed to be different for people in the asylum system, which is why very often we're told that there's very few disabled people in the asylum system. Yet, as you explain, the immigration and asylum legal and policy framework treat disability as if it was an afterthought without scrutinising its own role in producing or exacerbating the restrictions. So I'd argue that, in fact, things go beyond the legal and policy framework, and that disability is also only occasionally acknowledged by the asylum voluntary sector, and also only as an afterthought. And in addition, that too often the asylum voluntary sector actually takes the agenda for this from the Home Office rather than from the disabled people's movement. And if we're acknowledging that the system is disabling, then the obvious source of expertise on this should be the disabled people's movement. Now, I want to stress that I'm not a legal expert by any means. So I'm going to leave the legal implications of all this to Nicolette and Sophie, who know much more about this than I do. But I'm not sure that there is such a big contradiction between the two policy areas. So I'm going to explain why I think that is. So I'm going to look at the background and the similarities, what I think are the similarities between policies towards people in the asylum and immigration system and disabled people in the wider population, and very briefly talk about how we got here. And then I also want to look at how lessons from both the disabled people's movement and the asylum people who are in the asylum and immigration system could be brought together to improve resistance to the hostility that's faced in both areas. So I think it's important that we're clear about what's actually new. And so immigration policy is, and as far as I'm aware, it always has been designed to distinguish between people who are considered deserving and therefore eligible for support and those who are not. So the Refugee Convention exists to identify people who have a well-founded fear of persecution, and those who do not have always been framed as undeserving or without rights and liable to be deported or deprived of essential services. And also in the asylum and immigration system, entitlement to support depends not on need, but on proving where that need came from. So that's not new. And once anyone's framed as undeserving, then it's a relatively easy matter to extend that criteria to an ever wider population. And that's what's happened. So I'm happy for you to tell me that I'm wrong in terms of the legal situation, but my understanding is that almost every government since the Refugee Convention has brought in new immigration policy which has restricted people's entitlements even further. So the hostile environment is a culmination in that it isn't actually, it's where we've got to. It's a downward trajectory of policies rather than something inherently new. Now, you contrast asylum and immigration policy with the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. And you argue that policy towards disabled people is focused on addressing the barriers faced by disabled people. But I'd suggest if we're going to do that, then it would be more legitimate to compare the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees with the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. Because neither convention is actually policy, and the explicit hostility of the two policy areas are becoming ever more similar. So, what is distinct about the current times is not that there's distinctions between who's deserving and who's not, but it's that some people, that the hostility and lack of support for people considered undeserving is now explicitly malicious and deliberately designed to cause suffering. So, as you write, the hostile environment is designed to make undocumented migrants feel unwelcome. And worse than that, it's designed to prevent people from meeting essential needs. But at the same time, support for disabled people is being deliberately removed. As you may know, John Pring's book, The Department, he's highlighted how hundreds of lives have been lost as a result of the Department of Work and Pensions removing support from people. And that's deliberate policy and practice. And as you cite the work of China Mills, who says that the welfare system has been shown to have harm embedded into it by design as a feature, not a bug. So the hostile environment affects disabled people in the wider population too. So, yeah, the key characteristic, as you put it, that is distinct about the current situation is that human suffering is weaponized as a means of immigration control. And it's also being weaponized towards disabled people in the wider population as a tool of the welfare state. So we urgently need to build useful response to the horrors that we're facing. So I want to suggest that some insights from bringing together the lessons from disabled people's movement and what's happening to people in the asylum and immigration sector. So, yeah, you say that the rights of the CRPD are not tied to citizenship or immigration status, but it's also the reality that the rights of the CRPD are not actually extended to citizens in the wider population. They're not actually a reality. And that's despite the fact that there's been UN investigations of the situation in Britain. Yet you refer to the turn away from rights of inclusion and participation, and you refer to the hard-won rights of disabled people appearing precarious, with moves by government to make disability support harder to access. And possibly a key point from this is what we can learn from the current situation is that a rights-based approach was never sufficient response. And you refer to how rights-based thinking has been criticised for being individualistic, and contrast this by saying that the CRPD is heavily focused on participation. But perhaps that's the problem, that people's needs aren't going to be met through participation in a system that is designed to prevent people from meeting their needs. So some of the key founders of the UK disabled people's movement were opposed to the lack of focus on systemic change from the outset. As Finkelstein, who was very fundamental in the disabled people's movement, he wrote that while no one can object to campaigning for rights so that the prison in which we live is made more humane, nothing less than dismantling the prison and replacing it with a non-competitive form of society can break down the doors which bar our emancipation. And that was written 25 years ago, before the agenda had shifted to this more explicit hostility. So perhaps we're at a stage where we need to be questioning more what is the role of the CRPD. So policy that is imposed, the restrictions and policies that are imposed on disabled people in the wider population and in the asylum system is actively designed to restrict people's access to support. So one of the key principles of the disabled people's movement is that rather than disabled people needing to change to fit into society, there's collective responsibility to create a system that meets everybody's needs. So we undoubtedly need a stronger movement of resistance. And if our organising is not inclusive and accessible to everyone, then the movement is inevitably smaller and loses the opportunity to learn from each other. But I think one of the key things that comes out of bringing these two agendas together is that there's nothing progressive about including disabled people in an oppressive agenda. So, for example, some disabled people were spared from being housed on the Bibby barge, and sometimes disabled people are spared from detention because the buildings are inaccessible. But the point is, we don't need those places to be inaccessible or inclusive. We have to dismantle oppressive systems and create a system in which people are valued for their humanity, which means having full access to services and support based on people's need. And yeah, just finally, I have to confess that I find the recommendation for the right to work somewhat problematic, because I think that is one of the key problematic issues that is highlighted by bringing these areas of work together. And I realise that people need a source of income, and not at all denying that. But this demand is often framed as if it's common sense by the asylum voluntary sector, and we're told that it saves money for the Treasury, it prevents asylum seekers from being a supposed burden, and it enables people in the asylum system to do something constructive with their time. But the problems of this demand are highlighted when we bring the two areas together. And like disabled people in the wider population are actively dying. Hundreds of people have died because support has been cut off as a result of the sanctions that are imposed on people when people are forced to find paid work. And it would be naive to imagine that people in the asylum system would be treated better than people in the wider population. So if people have the right to work, then we can safely predict that all state support would be removed. And it seems extremely dangerous at this time to be demanding that there should be greater focus on individual responsibility rather than collective responsibility. So yeah, finally, just to wind up, thank you for writing such a useful and interesting paper, and it's hard to do justice to it in this time. I'd really like to discuss this much more with you. So yeah, I look forward to discussing it in much greater detail with you both. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Apologies, I couldn't find the unmute button. Thank you very much to all the speakers for this very, very difficult view that was put forward, but very, very realistic. Nicolette highlighted the inconsistencies between the obligations of the United Kingdom in the vis-a-vis the CP, the convention, CRPD, and also the barriers that have been put forward by the hostile environment. I think it was very interesting to see Sophie bringing real cases, and with this catastrophic, using your words, Sophie, this catastrophic impact that it has for people with disability, the barriers, primarily the new legislation that is going to, is being brought forward, has been brought forward, and is being brought forward, that will impact people, migrants in general, but primarily people that destituted people. Rebecca, when you talk about the resistance to this hostility I wonder how, the UK can reconcile this migration policies and this which is hostile to the environment, and how we could bring forward the obligations that, I mean, from a legal point of view, the obligations that the UK has vis-a-vis the CRPD, and also different, or the Refugee Convention, the European Human Rights Convention, and so on and so forth. So I think it's time for us to open the floor to questions. I think we have a couple of questions already here. One is, thank you for this innovative webinar and report. On an individual advocacy level, how can we support appeals rights exhausted people seeking asylum facing these policies that are designed to be disabling? I don't know if Sophie or...
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And thank you again to Rebecca for your presentation. I would really love to discuss those really insightful points with you. Okay, so thanks so much for that question. There's a lot you can do. Please, we're getting a lot of narrative at the moment about how apparently everybody wants really negative, hostile policies towards migrants and towards people seeking asylum. And so it is really useful to write to your MP and to say this isn't true, that you use the hostile environment, and that you want policies that are welcoming, supportive, and inclusive. One specific thing you can do at the moment, the government is consulting on a big chunk of the changes it's bringing in to the through the Immigration Act 2016. These are changes that will put families basically at risk of destitution, as they are not, in a way that they're not quite at the moment. So it's really problematic, and I would really encourage you to respond to that consultation and explain that you think this is a very bad thing to do. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sophie. There's a second question here. I think we have just about time to look at it. Should more common cause be made between groups advocating for the rights of disabled people and groups advocating for the rights of migrants, refugees? Are you seeing these groups played off against each other by politicians? So...
my short answer is yes. There's a really desperate need for solidarity between these groups, and we need to come together and stand together in fighting for systemic change and for a better world. And that's partly why we did this project. Nicolette may have more to say.
What I do have to say is to flag the Disability and Migration Network, which Rebecca has set up, because I think that is an excellent space. And Rebecca, you might want to say more about it. I'll just, in response to one of the points that you mentioned, which I think is really important. Yes, we do not want, I don't think anyone wants to play into categories of entitlements, and we want to resist that. And the people we were speaking with also wanted to resist that idea, right? So the binaries of refugee and non-refugee. are not something that we should be looking to build entitlements or need for support. It should be needs-based, as you're saying. And that is where perhaps I'll push back a little bit, because that's where I see the value of an instrument such as the CRPD and the other human rights treaties that are premised on universality rather than category-specific protection. And so sometimes I'll myself resist the idea of like refugee and the non-refugee binary, and because I think that something like the CRPD, with all of its problems of being, and I agree, being included in an unjust world, does not really, I mean, it only serves the interests of the few rather than the many. But I think that there we can build on our common humanity in a way that we can't with category-specific instruments. But I also want to flag that in a month's time, on the 12th of June, and we'll be sending round comms at SOAS, we're delighted that we'll be hosting Rebecca, who will be speaking, and who will be in conversation speaking about her book, Disabling Migration Controls, in conjunction with Ellen Clifford from the Disabled People Against Cuts. And I'll also leave it to you, Rebecca, to say something about the Disability and Migration Network, if that's all right.
Oh, hi. Yeah. Thank you both again, and thank you for the questions. Yeah, I totally 100% think it's extremely important that groups of disabled people and people in the asylum system, migrants, work together. In fact, I think that's the only solution that the only chance we've got in confronting the fascistic policies that we're facing is actually to build a stronger movement of solidarity. So yeah, I don't think we can underplay how important that is. Yeah, so the Disability and Migration Network is specifically about bringing together disabled people's organisations or disabled people in the asylum system, migrants and people in the wider population. We could put you on the mailing list. I'm not sure what's the best way of doing that. Maybe if people contact the organisers of like JRS and Nicolette, and then we can add you to the mailing list for that if you're interested. And yes, thank you, Nicolette, for inviting me to talk about my book with you and with Ellen on the 12th of June. I'm really looking forward to, in part, that will be taking these conversations further. So I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you so much.
Can I just emphasize that the report is now available on our website, so please download it, please read it, please share it with people. That would be great. Thank you.
Great, Sophie. That's why I was going to say that. Read the report, build movements of resistance, and it's stronger, that we are together than resisting all these trends and new policies. The more chances we have to counteract this lack of respect for the legal framework and obligations, if I put a very legal stint into it. But at least this is the very basic that could happen. Thank you, all the speakers. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this, and thank you everyone that is behind the screen. They attended the workshop. We don't have, I think we are over time, but yeah, get hold of a copy of the report, and let's see what comes next and what we can do for it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Everyone.